digitaljamsessions.com. Hello and welcome to this Digital Jam session. Today we're joined by Brian, Charles and Lee, who are all going to explain exactly who they are and what they do. But I'm going to start with Lee because you have been here before.
Yes, so I've been here before a few times now. So, welcome back to Digital Jam. So I'm Lee Starr. I'm a technical evangelist from Microsoft UK, and I'm responsible for helping game developers, educators and students understand more about the Windows platform and the opportunities of building games, content and services to Windows.
Wonderful, thank you. And Charles, why don't you tell us more about your illustrious self?
Well, my name is Charles Cecil. I'm the founder and the CEO, or managing director, as we like to call it in the UK, of Revolution. And I'm slightly proud in one way and slightly ashamed in another to say that we're actually celebrating our 25th anniversary. And looking back, I was actually quite young when Revolution started, and now I look quite old.
And why don't you tell us what the title is that you publish as Revolution?
Okay. Well, Revolution's done a number of adventure games. We're probably best known for the Broken Sword series, which we developed Broken Sword 5. We launched a Kickstarter in 2012, and we're really delighted because we raised $850,000 from 15,000 backers. But what's really exciting is, well, I'm sure we'll talk about this a lot more, but the ability to communicate directly with our backers in a way that hasn't been possible since really the early 80s when I started writing my first game. I wrote my first game for the Sinclair ZX81 in 1981.
Wonderful. And Brian, why don't you tell us more about yourself?
My name's Brian Baglow. I'm a digital indigent. I wander around the highways and byways of the internet, making trouble, but looking fabulous at the same time. Thank you. I've been in the games industry for about a year shy of 25 years. Worked with an awful lot of companies from startups, development studios through to major publishers. And 12 years ago, I started a little community called the Scottish Games Network to look after the growing number of games companies in Scotland. I'm now gainfully employed. My day job is currently working with a brand new digital media company called Team Rock, who are bringing together the worlds of rock and metal. You can't see me, but I am doing the devil horns thing with my both hands. And interactive games and media. So it's all sorts of exciting, and I get to hang out with a lot of rock stars who mysteriously die shortly afterwards.
Okay, we're not going to question that, but what I was going to say is, do you want to mention your short stint at Creative Skill Set as well, or not?
Yes, I did a short stint at Creative Skill Set as well.
Wonderful. Well, welcome, gentlemen, to the Digital Jam Sessions. Now, today, what we're going to talk about is what I'm going to describe as next generation franchises. Now, when I mentioned this to Lee, you had the perfect response in Skype. Not that you're biased and would use Skype because you work for Microsoft, but you had a lovely response about the types of franchises you thought would classify as next generation franchises. And I would love for you to start us off by throwing out that private conversation between us into this public forum of the podcast.
I knew I shouldn't have sent you that message.
Never ever send her a private message.
I know. She always makes it come back to, doesn't she? Yeah, so we were having an interesting discussion, and I think really it's more around what I would class as this new whole transmedia segment. So the example they used, because I am Microsoft, was Halo. So if you consider the Halo series, now it started off as a video game. It then became a video game and TV and online media. So the whole Waypoint campaign was lots of digital driven content. And then it's now gone into mobile. It's gone into consumables. So you can buy a Master Chief character set or a Halo vehicle. So again, it's a new form of that mass market media, I think, in terms of taking things to a new generation of franchises and to a new audience. I think really home are Angry Birds. So I'm sorry, but we all went through the Angry Birds saga as a parent. So, it was Angry Birds, water bottles, lunchboxes, cuddly toys, and the good old game.
Brian, what's your thoughts on what makes a next generation franchise, or what would you classify as a next generation franchise by comparison to Lee?
That's a really good question. And it's one of those ones that could have been asked any time in the last 3 decades, because it's one of those phrases that has become hideously overused and almost cliched within the games sector, because every time you talk to somebody, every time you go to one of the big events, the media, everyone's all over the next generation. The only reason that we're not talking about it and automatically assuming it's the next Xbox and PlayStation is the fact that the current Xbox and PlayStation are still reasonably new. If you ever find yourself yourself with half an hour to kill and, no recreational drugs at hand, I would recommend going onto YouTube and having a look at some of the videos which point out that mobile gaming is killing the games industry, despite the fact that 75 to 80% of all the developers in the UK are now working purely on digital channels, which is mostly mobile, casual, social and online. So it's one of these fallacies that real games happen on dedicated devices, because as we all know, games are now becoming ever more eclectic and ever more strange and unusual, to the dismay of some. But this is going somewhere, so bear with me. You can't dispute the fact that the likes of Candy Crush Saga, Clash of Clans and everything are making ridiculous amounts of money. And lots and lots and lots of people love them, which is how games started in the first instance. So I think for me, the next generation goes beyond the idea that there will be new platforms and new distribution mechanisms or new distribution channels and business models, and starts to look at the experiences themselves, because gaming is now simply a subset of the larger app market, if you want to be terribly condescending for a moment.
Charles, what's your thought on this in terms of what makes a next generation franchise?
I think probably slightly more interesting from my perspective is actually the transmedia, where you're actually mixing the medias and new things are coming out. So, last year, Her Story was very well received. And clearly Her Story mixes the idea of interactive video games, films, or film or television. And it comes up with something new that couldn't have been done without the expertise of different disciplines coming together. And I think particularly with VR and AR and mixed reality coming along, actually a lot of the skills that come from different disciplines will come together to create unique experiences. Keep Talking or The Bomb Explodes is a great example. And thank you to Simon Byron for bringing that with him when he came to stay with us this weekend, because it was fascinating to see the way that, a fairly traditional game could be brought across to a new medium. And I think the most exciting ideas are the ones that really start from the ground up with using a different range of disciplines to come up with something that feels totally unique.
I'm curious then, because I know that we've had this conversation before, Brian, when we're talking about the film industry wanting to become more aligned with the games industry and to have this kind of current development approach, if you like, to their franchises. And I do think there is more of a franchise trend now emerging, certainly with young adult franchises like Divergent or The Hunger Games, for example, where there is this real interest in not just producing a film, but producing a game. Whether that game is a good game or a bad game is another question, but a game nonetheless. And maybe a comic or two on the side, and various other kind of aspects that help to not necessarily enhance the franchise, but certainly to create more presence for that franchise in different places. And I'm curious from your perspective, Brian, whether or not you consider that kind of ticking the box exercise almost as something that is contributory to this kind of next generation approach to franchise, or do you think it is just a case of a marketer somewhere in a room saying, well, we need to have one of everything, let's just do it?
I think the marketing approach does tend to dominate, although that is now becoming far less common than it was, because it was, guys, we absolutely have to have a game. And it's very, very easy to just fall into the trap of licensing intellectual property back and forward, so that you fire something out to a developer who may not have access to the finished product, who are under very, very tight restrictions as to what they can do in terms of anything resembling the plot of the movie itself. So that's why we've seen so many very poor games based on movie franchises, because they're essentially treated as marketing tools. But I think now we're getting an awful lot more people from the film sector who are genuinely interested in far more cooperative deals. And you're starting to see an awful lot more things coming through that are genuinely more interesting. Some of the great examples are the Inception app for the Christopher Nolan film, and something like action movie effects from J.J. Abrams' Bad Robot, where it had really nothing to do with a specific film, but it kind of used film techniques to create something really fun. And then, of course, it was used as a marketing tool, but that was bolted onto the overall experience. So as he did Star Trek, you could then teleport yourself or get shot with a phaser, that kind of thing. So it's starting to change. And I think an awful lot of the pressure from that is from out with the game sector, because movie companies are recognizing that more and more people's primary point of contact with their content, the film, is coming through mobile devices.
So what's your take then on somebody like Blizzard and Blizzard Studios now approaching kind of the whole, let's translate our game franchise into a film franchise approach?
Come on, World of Warcraft is going to be absolutely awesome. The South Park...
But let me rephrase the question. Do you think this is a good approach for game studios, bearing in mind that not everybody has a property like World of Warcraft?
I think that's a really, really interesting point, because there's no one size fits all anymore. And in the past, over the last couple of decades, we've only had one approach, which was the licensing one, which is why Electronic Arts, managed to come up with films as diverse as Harry Potter, Lord of the Rings and James Bond, and pretty much create the same experience, albeit dressed differently, across multiple titles. We don't have that anymore. There are huge companies, there are smaller companies, there are indie film development studios, there are studios that are now combining the best of both worlds. So you can't simply parcel it all off onto the marketing team or just do the IP transfer through a licensing deal anymore. I think the opportunity is there, and more companies are realizing that it's not a question of just going, right, we tick the game box, but we now have an opportunity to do something huge.
Well, Warners are a good example, aren't they? Because obviously they did Harry Potter and licensed the games to EA. But with the Batman series, they actually bought Rocksteady. So they are covering all bases, and I'm sure we all really admire the Batman games from Rocksteady. I mean, they're absolutely brilliant games. So clearly they're with a publisher that is covering both film, television and other areas and doing it in an utterly brilliant way.
But don't you see this as just being transmedia? So, the likes of Disney have been doing this for a long time, Warner Brothers, Universal. I see all this as transmedia. I think the new opportunities of franchises is more around the consumerization of how people deal with things. So let's take, for example, the good old interactive voting. Everybody used to vote by a red button a few years ago. Now everyone's voting via apps. And those apps are becoming far more immersive into that actual experience. Let's look at X Factor. How much content was actually within the X Factor app? And I don't know what the stats were, but I can imagine there was far more people sitting on a couch with a second device, being far more involved in the second device screen than the TV screen, which should be the primary device in old terminology. So,
in the old days.
Yeah. I know Tanya doesn't watch anything live, so she's probably going to see it.
Nobody needs to know that.
But, this is where I think there's this huge opportunity of this whole, new merchandising model in that whole immersiveness of that experience and bringing it deeper. So X Factor travels with people wherever they go and they can watch that content, purchase the content, buy the tracks, vote on the track, comment on the track, etc.
So I suppose the question for you then, Lee, in terms of this Microsoft ecosystem and the way that people are experiencing that content and carrying it and taking it with them in their pocket. You talked there about that second screen and first screen, or the differences between the second and first screen. Do you think that there are enough people creating experiences, franchises, deciding to choose to have multiple screen experiences within those ecosystems? Do you see that happen a lot, for example, with Microsoft Glass, for example?
Everybody sort of gets into this way of delivering media, whether you take the big vendors like Sky, or everybody's now looking at how media and services can follow the consumer wherever they go. And it's really down to the consumer to when, how and where they consume that content. We've made big steps with the Xbox and, the ability to stream content to any Windows devices. So you don't have to be on an Xbox in your primary living room. You could be sat on the couch playing Halo on your Windows 10 device. So I think it's more around consumer choice now, and consumer choice of what device you use, what services you access, and again, how you want to access them. And I think that's been really evident to me in the way now people consume video content. So a few years ago, Netflix, Prime, etc., nobody would have been using. Now, predominantly, that's now becoming the number one way people consume that sort of content. And live TV has just died, as we know from our conversations.
Yeah. But Charles, I'm curious from your perspective. Obviously, you have dual interest here because you also are involved with BFI. And then from your perspective, do you feel that this is something now that is a consideration for these new franchises as they emerge? That there has to be this consideration for multiple channels, whether it's film and game and TV and comics and multiple different iterations of how this thing is going to live? Do you think that's more and more people are considering from the outset?
Yes, what a great question. I think it's quite clear that the large publishing companies were very content in what was happening before. They were selling games at retail. They controlled the route to market. And clearly, second screens, ways to interact have clearly disrupted that enormously. And in doing so, have thrown up opportunities for companies, which is now actually very much a combination between the huge companies like Sky and then smaller developers who can innovate. I have to say that from what we're doing, we are very much producing our games, our Broken Swords games, across multiple formats. Broken Sword 5 has been across 7 formats. So it's not an area in which we're actively engaging at the moment. And I think probably Lee's experience is much greater than mine. I would like to throw in one other question. And if I can go back to the comments about film. And I mean, broadly, I think we can accept that most video game franchises that have been turned into films have not resulted in a great product. And Brian was talking about this earlier, and he was talking about the various reasons. I think one of the key reasons that we also ought to mention is the core relationship that the player has with their character. Clearly, in film or television, in a linear, passive experience, the audience is given plenty of time, particularly with film, to build an empathetic relationship with the character. Whereas clearly in a game, because you immediately control that character and you're being made to work, you expect right from the beginning to be motivated. And to be motivated, you need to have an empathetic relationship, some sort of empathetic relationship. And there are different ways of doing this. One is to come up with very archetypal characters. And Lee, if you don't mind me saying, in Halo, you've got the classic Starship Trooper. You know, the moment you see that character, it's really obvious. We've all seen Starship Trooper. And if he didn't behave like Starship Trooper, and if he didn't have a gravelly American voice, one, we'd be disappointed. And two, we wouldn't have an immediate empathy with them. And clearly that's one of the reasons why licenses work so well, because the moment you buy a Harry Potter game or a James Bond game, you immediately know what to expect. And one of the reasons that it works very well in that direction is because a film can build an empathetic relationship and then translate it directly into a game. Whereas in a game, the relationship's quite different. So you have to work very hard to make that character compelling, empathetic when it moves from a video game to a film or television.
Do you think there might also be a certain degree of laziness as well in the translation of game to film, where there is almost that assumption that actually you don't need to do the hard work because this audience should really understand who this character is, for example?
To an extent, but then going back to Brian's point, I think often it's done very lazily. And a budget is set, and X% of that, which is normally quite large, is to pay for a license fee, and total minus X% is then turns out to be a lot less than's needed to produce a good game. But on top of that, you have the structural problem of empathy, certainly.
So my question then would be this, which is we're moving and kind of shifting towards, and I hate to bring it up, but it feels like it's time to bring up the whole VR thing. But considering that we're moving towards this generation of content that is going to be either VR, AR or MR, whether it's on the HoloLens or whether it's on Oculus, whatever that thing is, where actually there's going to be entertainment where it is kind of a quasi experience. It's going to be a little bit cinematic in its theme and in the way that it's presented. But at the same time, the user experience is going to be very much first-person shooter. It's going to be very much a game experience in some ways. And so when you look at it in that context, do you think that there is a bridge to be built here, Charles?
My feeling with VR, you'll have to forgive me for saying this, is that you can actually write games generally that would go across multiple presentation formats. And so you could have a first-person shooter. Personally, I think the most engaging experience is one where you are actually stationary and you're exploring the world. So clearly a number of us, I'm sure all of you will have seen, for example, The Hobbit on Oculus, which looks utterly brilliant. Or indeed the example that I gave on the Gear VR of Keep Talking and the Bomb Won't Explode or whatever it's called, which again is a new approach. I think when you go to mixed reality, my sense is that you really need games that are written absolutely specifically because you can't just port, which offers enormous opportunities in many ways creatively, but is also a threat. Because clearly, while VR is in its infancy, you can port games for an added experience. I don't think you're going to be able to do that with VR because I think the games are going to have to be written specifically for that display format. And I think that might, certainly to begin with, limit the number of games that are available.
Okay. So, Lee, because you should know better by now, I'm going to call you out on the message that you just sent me on Skype.
What? That is nonsense. Is that
No, it wasn't.
Why did you invite that idiot?
It wasn't Charles, honestly.
No, but he has sent me an article that says one day you'll use Microsoft HoloLens to watch the Super Bowl. Care to elaborate, Lee?
Yeah, this is something that was released, well, I think it was released today actually by the HoloLens team for the Super Bowl. So the Super Bowl 50 is this weekend. This is a commercial for the Super Bowl which shows fans of the Super Bowl watching the Super Bowl in a new experience, so using HoloLens. So they've got different fields of angle, they can look at different scores, they can bring players in and analyse them and look at their performance statistics, they can replay the gameplay and look at how the actual play was worked out, with overlays, etc. So it's a really cool video, actually. I think it's pretty cool of what that, as Charles said, the whole augmented reality and VR, but more importantly, the building of specific new experiences. And I think this is where the HoloLens team is at the moment within Microsoft. We have the Share Your Ideas scheme, which the HoloLens team is literally going out to developers worldwide and saying, share us your idea and we might build it for you and use it as a showcase app. So I think we're trying to do lots of cool things to do exactly what Charles has said, is think about these as new experiences. Brian's in a perfect situation of Team Rock. What could you do with VR and instrument?
Metal gigs, come on.
Yeah. Take Guitar Hero to a new level.
Actually, that is a good game right there, Brian.
Yeah, we should try and get the license. I can't imagine anything more fun than watching 4 huge muscled guys with white and black face makeup and long hair in VR helmets pretending to play instruments. I think that's a good hour's entertainment right there. I agree with my fellow speakers. I think VR is going to require a new approach. It's going to be very simple but kind of lazy to just take existing genres and experiences and port them over. And in some cases, they're not going to work, at least not straight away. Arguably, it took a while to refine the whole first-person shooter experience, moving it away from PC to console. And we know that there are a number of genres that simply don't work particularly well on smaller touchscreen devices, simply because they weren't created for that particular type of game. I've seen an awful lot of VR, and it's astonishing the amount of it which is kind of like, yeah, I know exactly what this is, but I have to wear a visor, versus the number of things where you go, oh my God, that's so cool. This is the future. And I think it is going to require the transmedia approach and developers who are thinking beyond the standard blowing crap up, rescuing princesses or collecting coins to actually drive things forward and open up and show some of the opportunities that VR and, for me, augmented reality, even more excitingly, are really going to sort of bring to the table.
Let's shift this conversation into augmented reality, because I actually think that this was one of those things that, yes, everybody loves talking about VR right now. But do you think that there is more interesting opportunity in AR that a lot of people aren't really talking about yet?
Yeah, testify.
So, Lee, given that you're working with the HoloLens...
No, I'm not working with the HoloLens. I have to stress that I'm not working with the HoloLens.
Okay, given that you have a view on the HoloLens, from your perspective, in terms of the opportunity with just AR versus VR, or even a combination of the two, what is your sentiment in terms of the way that people are approaching AR right now? Because I think there's a lot of people who traditionally have been in the space for an awfully long time, but there hasn't been much movement towards kind of getting ahead of the curve, if you like, other than these big players like Magic Leap and what have you, who have vaporware right now and lots of smoke and mirrors, but there's no real promise in terms of AR right now, other than HoloLens.
I think AR is kind of the hiding its light under a bushel at the moment. For me, I think it offers the freedom and the multi-platform experience that people are getting more and more used to and more comfortable with, and in some cases demanding. Earlier we mentioned the second screen experience. I've lost track of the number of very angry people at film festivals who have backed me into a corner at a networking event because I go on about mobile devices and the tablets and the second screen, and they're spraying cheap red wine spittle in my face talking about the sanctity of the cinema-going experience, despite the fact that I do kind of provoke them and say going to a big building with a special bright light and a big white wall to watch a film seems a little, 19th century. The reality is that, I think as Charles said
that's
earlier,
fighting talk.
Oh, totally. I mentioned there was free cheap red wine, right? And I am Scottish. The accent may have given it away. But the reality is that consumers are going to drive forward the new technologies which are adopted. The games industry has collectively lost its poo over virtual reality, but it's going to be up to the consumers whether or not it works. They're the ones that have so much content and so much choice now that anything that's not immediately accessible and convenient and fits into their lifestyles is going to get shoved to the side. I refer the honourable lady and gentleman to 3D televisions.
True, very true. For which I still have not bothered actually turning on the 3D glasses I have for my TV because, quite frankly, it's not worth it. But first of all, thank you.
Sorry, can I throw in? It was obvious at the time that 3D television wasn't going to work.
Yes.
It was a group of people who produced the technology. That was a classic case of technology attempting to lead the market. I'm going to go out on and it's not just being sycophantic because Lee's on this call. with HoloLens, what you have is you have so many obvious applications from a productivity perspective. I mean, just obvious that in work environments, it's going to be able to do the most amazing things. I think the game applications are probably less obvious, but I think unlike VR, which it's difficult to consider how big the market will be, because I think AR is going to be more useful in terms of productivity than VR. I think AR is going to create there will be a lot of devices produced for a wide range of work and then play experiences. And I think that we will probably find we have a larger user base than with VR. I find it quite hard to see VR truly hitting mass market.
I think the fundamental problem with VR is, as a mass market, inverted commas, you can't see me doing it. From a mass market perspective, it is still a niche. It's still a requirement that you put a box of some sort on your head. And quite frankly, that's not something you're going to do in public. You're going to do that at home in private if you're so inclined to do so. Whereas at least with AR, there's a distinct possibility that this is something that could happen in public places without it necessarily being very obvious and in your face, unless somebody decides to, make another Google Glass. But that idea that actually, AR can be something that is quite subtle. It can be something that is commercialized in advertising. So when you walk through a space, you have the Minority Report-esque experience of advertising that is just popping up around you. And everybody can see it, everybody can participate in that, rather than this very niche kind of closed door experience of VR, which VR is still very much an isolated and insular experience.
I think it's fair to say that virtual reality will have its killer applications, and it will have some very critical and crucial areas where it works perfectly well. But, when you sit down and talk to people, whether developers, whether they work in film, television, and you just say to them, come up with half a dozen ideas off the top of your head for augmented reality and virtual reality. The virtual reality stuff tends to be, here's stuff that we know, but you look at it through a helmet. And augmented reality, 20 minutes later, you've got to stop them because they're going off going, oh, you could do this, and you could do this, and you could do this. And it tends to be a lot easier, I do beg your pardon, to come up with ways in which augmented reality can be used rather than virtual reality. So I'm sure it will have a future, but I'm with you guys. I'm not entirely sure that it's going to be the salvation and saviour in the future of interactive entertainment in the way that some areas of the media are now reporting.
Okay, so one of the things that we ask all of the guests on the Digital Jam sessions is basically what it is that you think will be the most significant change that occurs in the next 5 to 10 years within your industry that will change the way that you work or change the face of your industry, whether that's a technological change or a cultural shift, whatever that thing might be. What do you think is going to have that significant change for you? And I'm going to start with you, Lee, because you've been on the show before, you've got more time to think about this question. What would be your response to this?
So I think it's just going to be, number one, the way we deal with data. I think data is going to be so key to everything we go forward. The Microsoft stand on that is what we call the intelligent cloud. Because I think it doesn't matter what we're doing today, there is some form of data being created by that, whether it's driving in our cars. And even today, you can get apps that allow you to get cheaper insurance depending on your driving methods. How has that worked out? By data. Through to what we bought at Tesco's last week and why we get a 50p voucher. So I think data is just there now. It will become more and more intelligent, and the business application of that data will become more intelligent. And that can be used across all different medias, whether it's that consumer selling point all the way through to the AI that sits within the game that you're currently playing. So I think intelligent cloud will be the change, in fact, over the next few years.
Okay, so therefore, do you feel that artificial intelligence or AI is something to watch for the next 5 years?
Definitely. There's 3 players in the market. So there's Cortana, there's Siri, and there's Echo and Google. Well, there's 4, isn't there? There's Echo and Google. I think, let's see where that intelligent assistant ends up.
And Brian, what would be your perspective on this?
Well, I do quite a lot of talks and presentations and workshops and bits and pieces to a whole variety of various people. I totally forgot to mention that at the start, didn't I? Well, I do. But one of the key things is, where are we going in the future? And I think it's the part of the presentation which has changed more than any other. Basically have to update it every 3 or 4 months. And in the past, it used to be, virtual reality, this is going to be huge. This is going to change things. And then it became clear it's not actually. I'm going to go with my good friend Jesse Shell here and say, I think it's the gamepocalypse, which ties very closely into what Lee's saying, which is that everything is going to become more aware, is going to be data enabled and able to communicate with other devices. And we're going to get more and more of these devices and big data sharing between a lot of different apps, which is going to make each and every single part of your life that little bit more fun and that little bit more gamified. I know that the gamification word is frowned upon thanks to marketers picking it up and screwing it up for everyone, but genuinely, we're seeing it happen in so many different ways. Jesse's Gamepocalypse talk was back in, I think, 2011 or 12, and we're already another 3 or 4 steps down the path that he outlined, where you've got Wi-Fi enabled scales, your toothbrush tells you how long to brush your teeth. We've got apps like Zombie Run, which is really starting to show people that you can have a bit of fun with even the most mundane tasks. Admittedly, it's not got me off my arse and off my sofa as yet, but it's only a matter of time. I think I need more zombies. But it is, I think, gamification and the notion of everything starting to talk to each other. And so gaming is not something that you basically sit down and do as a solitary pursuit. That will still happen. But the biggest change, I think, is going to be the fact that we have to start thinking far, far bigger and far more broadly about what a game actually is.
So, therefore, do you have an opinion on the Internet of Things and that idea that everything is interconnected and interacting and data is being transferred around? So, do you think that there comes a stage where actually too much data is necessarily a bad thing?
Tanya, it's already happening. We're seeing it in everything. There's all of the discussion and debate about Google at the moment. Are they filtering search results? Are they not filtering search results? Mm-hmm. How do they filter? And all of this kind of stuff. It's already a reality. Your mobile handset is on you pretty much all your waking hours. Mm. It now connects to so many different things. Even as we speak, I'm currently wearing a Jawbone which tracks my steps and tells me what I should and shouldn't eat. It's like having my mum back in my life.
I don't know. Personally, that's too much technology for me. Being instructed by the technology what to eat is just too much.
Whenever I actually give this talk, it's like when I get to the Gamepocalypse and explain the implications, it's like the scene in the movie Airplane where it's going down and the passengers are freaking out. People are running around, there are fires being set, pitchforks.
For the benefit of our listeners who've never heard of the phrase Gamepocalypse, and by the way, thank you so much for making this the one single episode I will have to edit the most for language and various other things. But
it's been a pleasure.
Thank you so much, Brian. Would you care to enlighten our listeners as to what a Gamepocalypse actually is?
So a US game designer named Jesse Schell postulated at the DICE conference several years back that instead of heading for ever more graphical fidelity and more powerful standalone consoles and game devices, dedicated game devices, that everything from micropayments, RFID chips, it's like mobile devices, the second screen, the Internet of Things, all of the data sharing and all of the apps are going to connect together in ways which will make your life as you exist every day more and more game-like. So whether it's counting the number of steps that you take every day, whether it's measuring your weight on an ongoing basis or your blood pressure or your heart rate through something like a fitness band, through to the fact that you can share achievements. And the achievements don't simply have to be in a video game context. It can be when you wake up in the morning, the fact that you went to bed at the right time. So it can extend from healthcare and fitness through to your leisure time. If you think about how Netflix actually reports back to Facebook what you're watching so that your friends can enjoy the fact that you've gone out and watched every episode of Lee Max Not Going Out in 12 hours over the weekend, despite the fact that you claimed you were out for a healthy walk in the sunshine. That's the Gamepocalypse. It's everything coming together. So this shared data and this Internet of Things and the fact that everything we do is getting more and more tracked is leading us towards what Jesse termed the Gamepocalypse, which is where we're essentially living in a big video game. All we're missing is the gigantically chested space marines, the dragons, and collecting coins to rescue a princess.
Okay, so Charles...
Which is what augmented reality is all about. Hence back to Lee and HoloLens. So everything is circular, isn't it?
Everything's all connected. It's all connected. But Charles, what's your view in terms of the next 5 to 10 years? What is that big shift going to be for you?
Okay, well, I have the difficulty in that I've gone third. So all the best ideas have already been explained.
I was trying to give you more time to think.
Thank you. No, there is that.
Xbox, Charles. A new Xbox. That's the future.
What do you think it should be called? Xbox 2? I don't know. Anyway, that's not my future. That's not my future. What I'm going to talk about is I'm going to go from the other end because there's obviously the push of the new technologies and what's available. And ultimately, all that really matters is what the audience want. And so I'd like to talk briefly about audience expectations and aspirations. And in mobile, we sell Broken Sword for $5 plus $5, in-app purchase, $10. 90% of revenues on iTunes come from free to play. And I'm very interested to wonder how, when that audience, free to play is great. It's built this massive audience. I'm very interested to know whether players will actually start to move away and do what we experienced with our Kickstarter, which is where people actually want to feel that they've got some sort of, they're part of the experience. And it's been extraordinary dealing with our Kickstarter backers, because what enthuses them is the ability to talk about something that they have a passion and talk to other people and build friends. And in a way that gets back to the Internet of Things, because people can communicate, because there are chat rooms, because people can both physically meet and virtually meet. It's created opportunities for them and for us that would have been unthinkable 3, 4, 5 years ago. So it is clear that ultimately audiences will drive the future, but they don't know what they want. They just know when they see it. So I'm going to put my money on the way that new opportunities arise for audiences to get involved with projects, new projects, exciting projects, partly funding, but more in terms of a community, giving feedback, being part of it, evangelizing, and in doing so quite reasonably and quite rightly feeling that they've actually had an impact on this project that they got really excited about in the first place.
I'm liking the notion that there is inherent connection to all of these things. And by the by, just as a side note, Lee, you are a wonderful podcast guest, because quietly in the background, as we've all been speaking, he's been pinging me links to everything you're talking about. So this week's podcast notes will be very thorough, and there'll be lots of links to all of the things we've been talking about. Thanks to Lee.
And are we allowed to say that Brian has just sent a little message saying swap?
So, gentlemen, in closing, we like to make sure that our listeners have a way of being able to follow you and find out more about what you do and what you're up to. So if you would like to share with us your social media handle of choice, I will start with you, Lee.
So mine is Lee Stott. So it's at Lee_Stott, STOTT.
Wonderful, thank you. And Charles?
I am quite simply Twitter at Charles Cecil, and that's Charles Cecil. No underscores or full stops, because I got in nice and early.
Wonderful, early adopter. And Brian?
You can find me in a number of locations, online, Twitter primarily. My own account is Flackboy, as in a PR flack, and it dates from my days as a young man. Or alternatively, if you're interested in the game sector in Scotland, you can find me at Scottish Games. Or if you really want to find out about the future of games meeting rock and metal, try at Team Rock Games.
Great, I'm never going to be able to fit all of those handles in one tweet, but thank you, Brian. So if you have enjoyed this content, thank you for listening. Don't forget to subscribe and review. And thanks again for joining us on this Digital Jam session. If you enjoyed this content, don't forget to subscribe and review, and follow us on Twitter at Digital Jam Ltd. Thinking of starting your own podcast? Why not speak to the GL Pro UK team? They handle all of our podcasting service needs. Tell them that Digital Jam Session sent you, and you'll get 10% off your first order. Find out more at www.glpro.co.uk. DigitalJamSessions.com